Okay, welcome to my latest iPad painting tutorial. Today's tutorial is going to be slightly different. I've got the latest 2020 iPad Air, so I'm going to be putting it to the test along, or rather at the same time, as producing one of my normal painting tutorials. Normally I'd use the iPad Pro, so I'm just going to see how it compares when I'm actually producing one of my paintings on it as well. So if you're familiar with my tutorials, you know I'm using the app Procreate. And if you want to follow along, use all the same settings that I'm using. I've got an A4 canvas. I'm going to be using the soft and the medium brush within the airbrushing setting, and I've selected a range of colours here within Procreate. Now I will put a link in the description to my Patreon page, and there is free information there. First of all, there's the hexadecimal codes that you can just type in, press enter, the colour will appear up there and you just drag it down into the colour palette area. But there'll also be a colour file there that's for free as well, and you can just download that and it should appear in your colour palette section, usually at the bottom area there. Okay, so the very first thing that I'm going to do on my first layer is I'm going to go to my colours, and I'm just going to get rid of the white background. There's not going to be any white left over. I may decide that I want to add a stronger white colour here so that I can add some real highlights. But the first thing we're going to do is select this yellow colour, and I'm going to drag it from the colour into the area, and it will just fill that layer. Okay, so we're going to use another layer. I like to keep things on different layers just so if it goes wrong or we need to adjust a certain part, then it's still separated and we can do just that. So we're going to move along to our next colour, which is here. We're going to go to our brushes, make sure we're within the airbrushing, then we're going to go to the soft brush. Now, because it's a new iPad and I haven't set it up yet, I'm going to transfer or move the sliders to the other area. So you can see if you go within the wrench symbol, go to preferences, you can select or you can toggle between right and left interface. So I prefer to have them there. All my tools are together then. I just think it works better that way. Maybe if you're left-handed, it would seem differently. So we're on the soft airbrush. Going to the size of the brush, and I'm going to put it at around 15%, and we'll keep it on 100% opacity there. And what I'm going to do is about halfway, we're just going to slide our brush across, and then we can just fill in the bottom portion of this landscape. And then I'm going to go to my adjustments, go to my Gaussian blur. I need to affect the whole layer, and I'm going to slide it across so that it blends it together. I'm going to put it maybe at around 25% there. Okay, we'll create another layer. We'll go backwards here to this third colour in, back to our brush. We'll keep the settings, everything the same. So again, it's at 15% size and 100% opacity. We're going to move down a little bit now. So we did that just above the halfway line, and we're going to do this a little bit lower. But again, we've just filled it all in. And again, we'll go to our adjustments, our Gaussian blur. We need to affect the whole layer, and we'll just blend it in a little bit. We'll create another layer, go back to our colours, and we'll go to the fourth colour along this time, and we're going to repeat the process. Same brush settings, move it a little bit further down, and we'll just apply it in that bottom section. We may adjust these, but I'm just going to repeat the process for now. And if we need to move them around, then we can do later on. So again, to the Gaussian blur, the whole layer, blur it across. Again, so I'm roughly going around the 25%, and that's more than adequate. So I'm going to create another layer. I'm going to move back to our colours, and I'm going to use this second colour in from the left. And on our brushes, we're going to reduce the size of the brush to around 10%, and I'm going to keep put the opacity at about 40%. And I'm going to start bringing this colour in at the top of our canvas. I'm just going to create a bank of what will be sections of cloud here at the top. I don't care if it's a little bit textured, which is why it's on the 40% opacity rather than 100%. So I can keep it quite loose, quite feathered in certain areas. I'm then going to reduce the size of the brush to around 6%. And I'm going to do another bank of cloud now, bringing it in a little lower. Something like this. Now, if I decide that I've gone too far down to my canvas, it isn't going to be a problem because I can just make adjustments with the transform tool, and I can just, if I put it on the freeform, I can pinch it in from the top and it narrows that section of cloud. So I can have it closing up in certain areas. Maybe we'll have it a bit more closed up at this side. I will go back in and add some finer tuning details onto that as well. but for now that will get the general effect. I'm going to create another layer. There's going to be lots of layers here. We're going to go back to our colours and we'll go for the first colour, which is the darker colour, which is more of a blue. If we go onto our colour disk, you can see exactly where it's positioned. It's squarely within the blue, but it is quite a greyed out version of it. But it's going to seem pretty blue compared to the other colours anyway. And I think I'll reduce the size of the brush to, or put it at around 6%, and maybe just turn the opacity down to 30%. It is going to be quite strong, so I want to bring it in gradually. So use circular motions. I do recommend that you lift the pencil off every now and again rather than doing it as one continuous thing, because then if you backtrack, you take a lot of gestures with you. So maybe just keep it as small circles. And I want you to work almost to the edge, but I want to preserve some of that pink colour, so I don't want you going right up to the very edge. You might want to turn the size of the brush down, in fact, just a little bit, so we'll turn it down to 4%. It really helps us get a little bit closer to the edge and be a bit more careful. And we'll do something similar on this layer as well. Again, it helps now that we've reduced the size of the brush, we can get a little bit closer to the edge in narrower sections. What I'm going to do now that I've placed some of that blue in is go back to that previous layer, go back to the pink I was using, reduce the size of the brush to about 3%. Again, we are on a reduced opacity, so it's still at around the 30%. And I'm just going to start adding some bits around the edge so it's not completely flat. I want it to be almost like, well, more broken texture on the very edge. And you'll be able to hear from the tapping of the Apple Pencil the way that I'm actually using my gestures. So I'm just creating more of a textured edge to that. I think it looks more like it's just wisping off on the very edge. I can also apply that to bits here to close it up in areas. Now likewise, if there's an area that perhaps I want to bring out a sense that there's light breaking through a little bit more, I can go to my eraser, check what brush I'm actually using on my eraser. I'll probably go to the soft brush again within airbrushing, reduce the size of the brush down a little bit to 3% and the opacity down to around 50%. But I can use this just to remove carefully bits of the pink that I want to create gaps. Go back to my brush, continue adding some of these wispy areas. If I want to add more, but I don't want them to be as noticeable, I can reduce the opacity to around 10%. And I can just keep applying in some of these lower areas, but they're not going to be quite as apparent. They're going to be a bit more subtle. And I'm pressing a little bit more lightly as well. So you don't want them to be too uniform, you want to keep them quite random. Now so far I have to say the iPad Air is pretty much the same experience that you'd expect from the iPad Pro. There are some scrolling issues. I find that sometimes it looks a little bit more jaggedy. It's a really subtle thing for the eye, but because we've got the 60 frames per second rather than the 120, that it means that some things are a little less smooth. Now it doesn't really make a difference in terms of the ability to create, but it is something that your eye does notice. And yeah, it does feel a little bit like I've gone back in time and was using some of the iPads previously that didn't have the ProMotion. It's amazing how you do get used to these things, but yeah, it isn't detrimental to the creative process. It doesn't really stop you being creative, but it is noticeable nevertheless. Okay, so we're going to go back to the very first layer, and I did say that I wasn't quite sure whether this yellow was going to be bright enough, and I feel like I want to add more light into a certain area, so I'm going to just move the colour that is there more around so it gets closer to the white, and I'm going to add another colour underneath. And I'm going to use that colour, put the brush a little bit bigger at around 6%, put it at around the 20% opacity, and I'm just going to start bringing that in. Remember, we're now on the first layer, the yellow layer, and I'm going to start bringing some of that whiteness into these areas. In fact, I might turn the size of the brush down a little bit to 4% and the opacity up to around 30%, just so we can really intensify the brightness of it. And we'll add some into the gap there as well a little bit. Now one thing that doesn't look quite right when you do that is the edge of the cloud, because we've got quite a dull colour next to a very bright colour. So what you probably need to do in that case is go back to our first colours. Now they are quite dull, but these are about the right brightness. So we'll go to that second colour along, and we'll just use now that colour just to go around the very edge, just so it blends in the brightest colour that we've just added with the edge of the cloud a little bit better. So it looks like it's transitioning from the very white now to the warmer but darker colours. And we can keep working on those. So I'm going to whack the opacity up to 50%, turn the size of the brush down to 3%, and just really work into these white areas now. Now if we don't feel like it's showing up enough, it's probably because we have another layer slightly over the top. So we'll move upwards, we'll go on to layer 2, and we'll keep working this white colour onto layer 2 as well. We'll bring it down just a little bit. Likewise, when we change colours, we can always go back to our yellow. By bringing that down, we're eating into some of these warmer, darker colours, and we're bringing some of this light effects, making it appear like it's highlighting maybe some just textural things in the sky, some bits of cloud. And it's stopping it being completely flat, and a bit more white here as well. Okay, we're going to go to the top of our layers, and we're going to add another layer. And this time I'm going to go back to my colours. Instead of these two colours, we're going to use these two colours. So we're going to go for the pink colour again. And I'm just going to decide where I'm going to put a lower section of clouds. So I'm going to put the opacity at 4%, or rather the size of the brush at 4%, and the opacity down to 40%. And I'm going to have a gap where we've got mainly just the light coming through, and then we're going to have another bank of clouds coming into this section. So we'll have it sweeping all the way across, breaking perhaps as it goes, but all the way across it goes anyway. Maybe turn the size of the brush down to 3%, maybe have some sections that break away. Go over the bits that you feel you want to just intensify, make them a bit darker. I'm going to increase the size of the brush to 6%, and I'm going to now add another lower section to our cloud as well. We can take this a little bit further down as well. I'm going to add more elements in this area, so it doesn't really matter, but we may as well take it a bit further down. In fact, we'll turn the size of the brush up and we'll just fill in that area. Maybe even turn the opacity way up as well. So just whack it up to about 70%. Like that. Something else we need to do, like we did last time, is work on the edges. So we need to reduce the size of our brush now again to around 3%. Maybe turn the opacity down to around 40%. And we're just going to work on the edges, add some finer textured detail along that edge. Maybe work into those little banks of clouds that separate, but maybe they have some blobs as they start to break up and disintegrate. You can add as many banks of clouds as you want. I do want to preserve a central area there with more light coming through, but I can add more detail to it as well. Fill in this area, have it really fragmented. Okay, I do feel like what would be beneficial is to go back through my layers and actually increase the impact that some of these lower layers are having. Now, if I go onto this layer 4 and I just toggle it on and off, you can barely see it at all. So that tells me now that using that layer, I need to go to my transform tool and I need to just bring it up a little bit more, and that way it's going to have a bit more of an impact there than it did before. So you can see without me moving it, and now I'll bring it up a little bit and it's having more of an impact in this area. So I feel that works a little bit better. Now, moving back to my colours, I'm going to use the other colour here that I've not used yet, which is again, it is almost heading towards the blue, but it's not really. It just appears that way next to the pinky colour that it's next to. You can see it's got a hint more blue in it, but it's still very much in the red area, but it is greyed out, so it gives it a cooler look. We'll go to our layers, we'll go to the top layer and we'll create another layer above that. And this time we're going to work into our cloud. So again, we're at quite a small brush size, so maybe about 3%, and we're at about 40% opacity. And we can just use this to bring out some of the detail of the cloud. Bring it forward a little bit, especially at the bottom section of each of these banker clouds. Maybe as it gets towards the top, it's getting more of the light hitting it, and so it breaks up the darkness perhaps. But certainly the bottom edge of each of these banks of clouds, you'd expect to have more of a solid, dark, shadowed area. And I'm just going to continue adding some more texture into this bottom section. I can start by pressing on lightly, so I don't want to add too much into this area just in this bit, but then as it gets further down, I'll press on a bit more, add a bit more of it so it gets more of that darker colour creeping in. So I'm pressing lightly, having it quite broken for this top section. Maybe I'll increase the size of the brush to 5%, so when we get down here, it's going to have more of an impact. And I can just really start to fill it in this bottom section, because we're going to start adding more landscape features here anyway. Now in theory, the responsiveness of the Apple Pencil should be a little slower on this compared to the iPad Pro. Again, the 60 frames per second compared to the 120 frames per second means that as you draw a line, the actual following of it shouldn't be as quick on this version compared to the iPad Pro, but it's not, again, something that's that noticeable at all. Unlike the kind of the way that it animates things, I really don't notice any more lag when I'm actually drawing on the screen compared to the iPad Pro. So that's not something you need to worry about. Okay, I'll come back to the sky perhaps a little later, but I'm going to add another layer. I'm going to move to our other colours now. So I'm going to use this first colour, and we'll turn the size of the brush down to around 3%. We're still on the soft airbrush. I'll turn the opacity up to around 80%, roughly 80% anyway. I don't want it quite on 100% opacity. It just gives a bit more texture when you reduce the opacity a little bit. And I'm going to place in a horizon line to begin with. Now, you won't see this particular line because it's going to be covered by other details, but it is important that you do set one. In fact, it's a little bit high that, so I'm going to reduce it down a little bit lower. Not too much, but just a little bit lower down. You'll notice by when I held the Apple Pencil at the end, it snapped to a straight line. Really great function for creating horizons and things like that. So from this line now, I'm going to start to create some distant trees. In fact, that opacity is too much. I'm going to turn it down to around 50%. I'm just going to create some circular motions from the very far distance. It's a combination between trees and maybe rolling hills. We don't really need to clearly define exactly what they are. You're not going to notice individual tree shapes, because when you get lots of trees that all clump together, it's kind of difficult to distinguish them from the actual landscape and the hills itself anyway. You notice I'm still using this circular motion all the way across. So we'll create another layer, and we're going to move along our colours to the next colour here. We're going to also change our brush to a medium brush, and we're going to turn the size of the brush down to around 2%, and we're going to put the opacity back again at around 50%. So we're going to start creating some trees and features that perhaps are a little bit more individual, stand out and have a more distinct shape perhaps than the background had. But we're going to start creating things that do stick out a little bit. Now, it is important that you do them a little bit lower down in certain areas so that you do see, obviously, the background layer. You don't want to do it at the same height, otherwise there's no point having done the background layer. It's okay if it touches in areas, but as a general, we want to keep some of that and preserve some of the background layer so we create a sense of distance. So again, I'm keeping, on the whole, some kind of circular motion, but you can vary it a little bit as well. Some trees that maybe stick up a little bit more pointed. Some that perhaps are tall enough to go above everything else, because as we come closer, generally we're going to get some things that will go a little bit taller as well. So maybe the trees that are in the very far distance are actually on a hillside that appears a little bit higher, which is why we can see them. But as we get closer, they're more likely to be on the ground, but perhaps they're also a little bit taller. So as a general rule, they'll be a little bit lower, but you do get some features perhaps that stick up a little bit further, if that makes sense. Okay, we'll create yet another layer. We'll go to our colours, pick the third colour along this time. This colour is going to really stand out. We'll keep the other settings the same, but these details, these trees are really going to stand out. So you just need to be aware that they should be a bit taller as well. So we can have some really nice big bushy shaped silhouettes of trees. Again, we're not getting bogged down in the detail with these, we're just creating overall impressions of things. Allow some of the gaps to remain. We want to see those background layers in certain areas. So we're just being quite expressionistic, we've been impressionistic rather, so we don't want to completely get bogged down in the detail. You notice I'm not zooming in, I'm more about creating the impression, so again quite impressionistic, but the overall effect, even though we're being quite loose, should be quite convincing as an illusion nevertheless. So again, we'll have one or two trees that really just stick out and is more prominent. So think about the overall shape. Perhaps you can just get the suggestion that it's branches or a trunk cutting through. Move along, add another shape, perhaps another tall tree here. Again, some kind of suggestion of trunk. But then once you get a middle section, you can just create some darker blobs surrounding it, which is going to be just more texture for the tree itself. And perhaps another nice big tree section that sticks up a little further this way as well. We do have a last dark colour, and we'll create another layer, and we're going to do something pretty similar. Perhaps there's just a hedge nearby that has some things that stick up in certain areas. Don't need to add too much of that colour. I'm going to create another layer. I told you there's going to be a lot of layers here, and yeah, we're using quite a lot. So we're going to go along to our last colours now. We're going to go to this first colour, which you can see is very much within the green, but it is very, very dark. So we're going to use this dark colour just to fill in the bottom section. So I'm going to put the size of the brush up to about 5%, and we'll have it at around 70% opacity. And we'll just fill in this bottom section. I have to say, when I'm filling in large areas like this, and sometimes I can see the actual colour lagging behind the Apple Pencil just a little bit. Although I said it's not that noticeable for the largest part, I did just notice it then a little bit in a way that I'm not perhaps used to with the iPad Pro, but again, I don't think that's such a big deal. I can't imagine it's going to be the kind of thing that would interfere with the creative process for anyone. You can see it's doubled over there a little bit, that isn't a problem. I'm going to turn the opacity down, and I'm just going to go back over the whole of that area. Fill it in. I'm happy with some of the gaps and the textures to remain. Like that. We're going to use quite a lot of greens over the top of that anyway, but I do think I want a really solid line there on the kind of a horizon point. So I'm going to reduce the size of the brush to around 3%, 2%, opacity up to around 80%. And I'm just going to pick my horizon point, take it all the way across, hold and let it snap, and there you go. We've got a really solid horizon line to work from at this point. So again, I'm going to go back, working below that horizon line just to tidy up some of that area, and I feel that's going to work a little bit better. So we've created that on a whole new layer. So if we wanted to anyway, we could always use the adjustments, or the transform tool rather, and we could slide it around if we felt we needed to. So looking at my other colours, I have a paler green here. Again, it's not really a lot different, but you can see it's just shifted a little bit. And we'll stick with the 80% opacity, and we'll keep the small size to around 2 or 3%. In fact, we'll take it even smaller to the lower end of 2%. And I'm just going to bring it across and just start to add a bit more variety of the types of green that actually cuts across there. It's a subtle detail, but I think it's better. And we'll go back to that green there, and perhaps just break it up a little bit more there as well. So create more texture, contrast between the lighter and the darker versions. Create another layer. We'll go to the next two greens. We're going to use the darker colour first, and we're going to bring it just a little bit down. So we're not right at the top edge. We're going to continue adding this kind of texture as we get closer to us, or the viewer, assuming there's someone stood here looking at the scene. We're adding just a little bit of this darkness as it comes closer to us. So we've got pretty large stripes that cut straight across really. Again, we'll go to our lighter colour as well, which is this fourth colour along. Perhaps turn the size of the brush up just a little bit so it's around 3%. And we'll just add some of this lighter colour starting to cut into here as well. It's much more of a vivid green starting to appear, which I think is needed. One of the things about perspective and distance with colour is that you get your more vibrant colours closer to you and cooler colours generally in the distance. So your greens are getting darker and cooler in the distance, and they're getting warmer and more vibrant to you as they get closer to you. I think we may as well just stay on the same layer for this last section. We'll go to this very dark colour. I'm not bother changing the adjustments on the brush. I'm just going to add suggestions of texture. Reduce the canvas size just a little bit so I can work right up to the edge. And we'll go to our more vivid green here as well. Whoops, go to the green. We'll add just a hint of that in there as well. Now, again, I'm only really about creating the impression. Now, if you wanted to go to a more textured brush to almost create the effects of grass, then you could do that. But in terms of creating the general effect, I'm happy to keep it quite rough. So alternate between those two colours. Perhaps I just need a slight darker lines cutting in there a bit more as well. Not too dark though. Remember, on 80% opacity, so I'm pressing on very lightly. If you feel like you're a bit heavy-handed, you could always turn it down, and then it doesn't matter if you press on a little bit more anyway. So we're going to create another layer, and I'm going to move along, or rather keep it on this dark colour that we've just been using. We'll have the size of the brush at 2%, the lower end at 2%, and we'll have the opacity at 40%. And I'm just going to start adding a couple of focal points into our scene. So I'm going to move to just a little bit below the horizon line. I'm going to start building a tree into our scene. So I'm going to put the trunk first. I'm going to imagine it coming up to around here. And then we're just going to start constructing some branches that are going to be mainly obscured anyway. But it helps if you put them in there to begin with and you know what the structure of the tree is going to be underneath everything. So we'll just get some branches. Doesn't need to be much more than about that. And then with a broken texture, again, we're still on the medium airbrush. I'm just going to start adding sort of tapping broken textures around ends of some of these branches. So you create clusters of individual blobs. So you can hear me, I'm using lots of little tapping motions. Allow some areas to get really condensed so it gets really dark, but then also leave certain areas where it's quite sparse so you can see through the tree gaps as well. Now it is a little bit time consuming to do it this way. You may find that there are certain brushes that do the job for you, but I do like to do things like this quite manually. I do take satisfaction in having produced all of the effects on a particular painting. So however best that you feel that you can achieve the look, however makes you most satisfied with it, then feel free to do that, but I just like to do it manually. Now if there's certain areas you just want to darken up, have a bigger cluster, increase the size of your brush, start to fill in some of those gaps. Reduce it back down again, add some finer details. Maybe add some details at the base of the tree as well. I'm going to move just a little bit further down, so it means that whatever I'm drawing now is going to be a little bit closer. Create some bushes, and perhaps a little bit further down again. Going to create some more shrubs, some more bushes. Going to create another tree here as well. And very much in the style of Bob Ross, where I suppose we're creating a little friend for that tree, aren't we? I'm just going to go along that horizon line, just darken up that top edge. I feel like it needs to be a little bit more clearly defined and set apart. It could be that there's some hedges in the distance, maybe some walls to separate it out. And I'm also going to take our lighter coloured back here. So we'll go for this colour, and I'm just going to use that to almost create like a low-lying mist as well that separates the two. In fact, if I turn the opacity down a little bit more, I think it would be a good idea just to bring that colour just a little bit into our scene, a bit more, just to kind of soften the two together a little bit more. Maybe there's a bit of an early morning mist that is just covering some of these areas. In fact, I'll turn the size of the brush up to around 5-6%, and we'll just bring that effect in a little bit more, soften that area. Just soften the base of those trees, especially this one, pushes it back a little bit further. Go back into some of these areas. It doesn't really matter about swapping layers at this point. Turn the size of the brush down and the opacity up, and really just want to create a slight more sense of mixing of those different types of greens together, just to break it up a little bit, just so it doesn't look quite as flat. I think at this point I'm going to create another layer. I'm going to go to my brushes, I'm going to go back to soft brush, have the size of the brush at around 3%, opacity down to around 30%, and I just want to create some areas here. Perhaps there's wispy bits of cloud that cut in front of some of these other clouds. Like that. You can also go back into other areas and just tighten up some of the details that we've got here, really sharpen up bits of the cloud. So I've just turned the size of the brush down to around 2%, and just really work if that's too much, but generally just work into areas, sharpen up some of the edges of those clouds, make a finer detail. And this is the kind of thing that normally I would love to spend hours just sharpening up those details, fine-tuning the little elements that can make a piece of work really fantastic. Now, you could go back through your layers to make sure that you're only working on perhaps the cloud layers, for example, wherever they are now. They're further back, aren't they? Here, those layers. Or you could just work on your top layer at this point. You've got the fundamentals there, so it doesn't really matter if you go off and you work on your top layer and you just keep working over the top of it. It doesn't really matter at this point in a painting. It's easy to get lost anyway when you have that many layers. It's easy to get confused to exactly what's on each layer. So there does come a point at which you just got to be brave, perhaps. Choose a layer that you're working on and just work on top of that. So I'm just turning the size up and down to respond to the particular cloud areas that I'm working on, just sharpening up some of the details. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this now. I'm just showing you the kind of things that I would probably go on to actually do. But like I say, the purpose of this tutorial is to just get you to the point where you understand how to construct the basic image, and then the fine tuning is something that you can do at your heart's content. I am just adding a little bit of lighter colour between the gaps, so that general sunlight is coming down further into the scene as well. So I'm using these warm colours. Anyway, I hope that's been useful. Overall, my impressions of the iPad Air is that it's pretty good, to be honest. Fundamentals of using an app like Procreate don't really change between different iPads. It's pretty much the same experience, apart from some slight animation issues when you're actually moving things around, but it's very subtle a difference. The fundamental interface with the Apple Pencil and the screen compared to the iPad Pro is pretty much identical. So you should be able to add just as many layers to this as you would be able to on the iPad Pro from a couple of years ago, the 2018 one because it's got 4 gigs of RAM just like that one, so you're going to get plenty out of the iPad Air. Anyway, do check out my other tutorials. There's playlists in the description to this video. There is a link to my Facebook, my Instagram, and of course the colours that I mentioned before as well. Thanks for watching. Catch you back here soon.